August, 793. The monastery at Lindisfarne lies quiet. Monks chant softly as the sun breaks over the sea. Then, suddenly, shadows loom on the horizon. At first, the people of the coast think they see longships, the dragon-prowed vessels of raiders. But these are different. Vast steel giants glide across the waves, their decks flat, their silhouettes alien against the morning sky. The age of the Vikings has changed. For on these decks sit machines no one in the 8th century could imagine. Jets and helicopters, creatures of fire and thunder, waiting to be unleashed. What if the Vikings had aircraft carriers? The very thought defies history. Vikings were already among the most feared warriors of the early medieval world. With their longships, they raided as far as Ireland, France, Spain, even reaching North Africa and Constantinople. They discovered Iceland, Greenland, and even North America centuries before Columbus. Their ships were marvels of design, shallow drafted for rivers, sturdy enough for the open sea. But those ships carried only swords, axes, and bows. Their speed was wind and oar. Their power was courage and ferocity. Now imagine that instead of wooden longships, the Vikings controlled steel leviathans, aircraft carriers armed with planes, helicopters, and radar. The balance of the medieval world would shatter overnight. The first question is dominance. Aircraft carriers are not just ships. They are mobile fortresses, able to project power hundreds of miles inland. A single carrier group in modern times can launch dozens of aircraft, fighters, bombers, reconnaissance planes, striking targets far beyond the reach of any medieval army. In the 8th and 9th centuries, when kingdoms were fractured and armies rarely numbered more than a few thousand, such a force would be unstoppable. Castles, towns, even entire cities would burn before a Viking army ever landed. Now imagine Paris, 845. In our history, the Viking chieftain Ragnar sailed up the Seine with 120 ships, besieging the city until he was paid to leave. In this alternate world, Ragnar would not need siege engines or fire arrows. Jets would scream across the sky, dropping precision strikes on the city walls. Helicopters would ferry Viking warriors directly over the battlements, landing them inside the defenses. The siege of Paris would last not weeks, but hours. Or consider Constantinople, the jewel of the Byzantine Empire. The real Vikings, known as Varangians, served as mercenaries in the emperor's guard. But with carriers, they would not serve Byzantium. They would conquer it. The mighty Theodosian walls, which resisted armies for 1,000 years, would crumble in a single day beneath aerial bombardment. The capital of the Eastern Roman Empire would fall to Norse hands centuries before the Ottomans. The psychological shock would be immense. Medieval peoples believed in omens and signs. To see fire-breathing machines descend from the skies, to watch steel birds destroy stone walls, would not only terrify armies but break their will. Whole kingdoms might surrender without resistance. But there is more to consider. Aircraft carriers are more than weapons. They are symbols of empire. Whoever controls the seas controls the world. In the medieval era, seas were the highways of trade and power. Carriers would give the Vikings absolute dominance of every ocean they touched. Their raids, once opportunistic strikes on coasts and villages, would transform into full-scale invasions. England, instead of resisting for centuries, might fall within a generation. Viking kings could rule not just as raiders, but as emperors. A Norse empire stretching from Scandinavia to the Mediterranean would become inevitable. Yet the question arises, could the Vikings even use such weapons? Carriers demand enormous crews, training, and infrastructure. Planes require fuel, ammunition, and maintenance. Without the knowledge of modern engineering, could Vikings keep these machines alive? In this scenario, we assume yes, they can. That these ships and planes arrive fully operational, needing only Viking hands to direct them. The Norse were skilled sailors and fearless adventurers. If given the tools of the modern age, they would adapt quickly. Their culture prized exploration, innovation, and boldness. And with the firepower of the 21st century, they would find ways to wield it. The cause and effect chain is staggering. Europe in the early Middle Ages was a patchwork of kingdoms. The Franks under Charlemagne, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of England, the fragile remnants of Rome and Byzantium. None of these could withstand nuclear-age naval power. Charlemagne himself, the great emperor of the Franks, might never have built his empire. His armies, marching on horseback and foot, would be helpless against airstrikes. The Carolingian Renaissance, the revival of learning and culture, might never have happened, crushed beneath Viking domination. Europe's political and cultural development would shift dramatically. Viking rulers, empowered by their new weapons, might impose their own customs, languages, and traditions across conquered lands. Instead of monasteries spreading across the continent, great halls and fortresses of Norse design might rise in their place. By the year 1000, Europe could be a Norse empire, its culture, laws, and stories shaped by Scandinavia. But the transformation would not end in Europe. With aircraft carriers, the Vikings could cross oceans not in years but weeks. Their real voyages to Greenland and Vinland were dangerous, limited by weather and supplies. With carriers, they could dominate the North Atlantic effortlessly. Settlements in North America could thrive centuries earlier, backed by military might. Imagine it. Viking colonies stretching across Canada and the eastern United States in the 9th century. Native peoples, armed with bows and spears, would be powerless before jets and helicopters. By the time Columbus would have sailed in 1492, the New World would already be an old Viking world. And what of Asia? Vikings reached as far as the Caspian Sea in history. With carriers, they could sweep through the Middle East, conquering ports and cities. Trade routes that once linked Europe and Asia would fall under Norse control. The riches of Persia, India, even China might flow northward into Scandinavia. By the 10th century, the Norse could preside over the first true global empire, an empire built not on slow expansion, but on the sudden leap of technology. Yet, even with overwhelming power, dangers remain. Aircraft carriers are mighty, but they are not invulnerable. They require constant supply of fuel and ammunition. In a world without oil refineries, manufacturing plants, or spare parts, the carriers might slowly wither. Planes would crash without maintenance. Engines would fail. Weapons would run dry. At first, the Vikings would conquer with ease. But as their supplies dwindled, their advantage might fade. Perhaps by the 11th century, their empire would begin to fracture. Their great ships, unable to sustain themselves, would become drifting hulks, monuments to a power the medieval world could neither understand nor replicate. And what then? Would the memory of Viking carriers become legend, transformed into folktales? Stories of sky ships that rained fire, of steel beasts that roared across the heavens? Would medieval chroniclers write of thunder machines, of ships that carried the power of the storm itself? History might remember the Viking Age not as raids and conquests, but as the age of fire from the skies. The lesson is profound. Technology, when introduced ahead of its time, does more than change battles. It changes civilizations. The Vikings, fierce and daring, were already a force of history. With the weapons of the modern world, they could have reshaped not just Europe, but the entire globe. So, what if the Vikings had aircraft carriers? The monasteries of Lindisfarne would not just fall, they would burn from the skies. Paris and Constantinople would bow before Norse power. America would be colonized centuries early. A Norse empire could dominate the world. But power without the means to sustain it is fleeting. Carriers would rust, engines would fall silent, and in the end, the world might be left with ruins and legends of machines that once ruled the seas. And that leads to the next question. If Vikings with carriers could reshape the Middle Ages, what other leaps might have changed history? What if the Roman legions had tanks? What if Napoleon had nuclear submarines? What if medieval knights had drones? History is fragile. One weapon, one invention, can alter the course of nations. And sometimes, imagining these what-ifs reminds us how much of our world depends not only on human courage, but on the tools we wield